Part 2, The Science of SOULS, Chapter 9. The first miracle, the woman on the table was dying. Her name was Vera Lindstrom, and she had been a navigator third class before the tumor in her brain had grown too large to ignore. The growth pressed against her third eye, sending cascades of false visions through her consciousness. Warp shapes that weren't there, currents that didn't exist, presences that might or might not have been real. She could no longer perform her duties, could no longer be trusted to guide a ship through the immaterium without leading it into disaster. She had 6 weeks to live, maybe less. But she had volunteered for newborn, and if Dr. Hiro Tanaka's theories were correct, death would not be the end of her story. "Beginning neural mapping sequence," announced Dr. Yuki Sato, her fingers dancing across the interface. Around the operating theater, a dozen technicians monitored readouts that tracked every spark of electrical activity in Vera's brain, every chemical fluctuation, every quantum state that might, according to Tanaka's theories, contain some fragment of consciousness. Tanaka stood at the observation window, his hands clasped behind his back, his face betraying nothing of the tension that coiled in his chest. 23 years of research had led to this moment. 23 years of mockery, marginalization, and the quiet contempt of colleagues who thought he was chasing phantoms. Today, he would prove them all wrong. "Subject is stable," Sato reported. "Consciousness integration matrix is online. Beginning transfer protocol in T-minus 60 seconds. Vera's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. She had refused sedation, wanting to experience every moment of what she believed would be her resurrection. Her lips moved slightly, forming words that the microphones couldn't quite catch. "She's praying," observed Dr. Marcus Webb, one of Tanaka's junior researchers. "I didn't think anyone still did that." "She's not praying," Tanaka said quietly. "She's saying goodbye to the body that's failing her, to the life she's leaving behind." The countdown reached 0. The machines hummed with power that had been building for hours, channeled through crystalline matrices that Tanaka had spent a decade perfecting. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with energies that human senses could barely perceive. On the table, Vera Lindstrom took her last breath. The monitors flatlined. Her heart stopped, her brain activity ceased, her body became a cooling shell of flesh and bone. By every medical definition, she was dead. But in the integration matrix beside her, a construct of warp-reactive tissue grown in the newborn labs, shaped into a form that mirrored her original body but free of the tumor that had killed her, something began to stir. Neural patterns propagated through the artificial substrate. Synaptic connections formed, mirroring the architecture that had been mapped from Vera's dying brain. Memories, personality, the ineffable something that made Vera Lindstrom who she was, all of it flowed from one vessel to another, crossing a bridge that should have been impossible to build. The process took 17 minutes. 17 minutes of held breath and racing hearts and monitors displaying data that rewrote everything humanity thought it knew about consciousness and death. Then the Einherjar opened its eyes. They were Vera's eyes, the same pale blue, the same slight asymmetry that had made her face distinctive. They blinked, focused, tracked across the ceiling to find Tanaka's face in the observation window. "Dr. Tanaka." The voice was Vera's voice, slightly hoarse, uncertain. Did it work?" Tanaka's hands were shaking. He pressed them against the glass to steady himself. "Vera, do you know where you are? Do you remember what happened?" "I remember dying." The Einherjar sat up slowly, looking down at its new body with an expression of wonder and confusion. "I remember the darkness closing in and then light. So much light. And then I was here. What's your mother's maiden name? Johansson? Where did you grow up? Lunar Colony 7, Sector 12, the apartment with the view of Earth. What was the name of your first commanding officer? Captain Yusuf Okonkwo. He had a scar on his left cheek from a docking accident. He called me Little Navigator because I was the youngest on the crew. Tanaka turned to Sato, his eyes bright with tears he refused to shed. Memory consistency, 97.3% match with pre-transfer baselines. Personality profile is within expected parameters. Cognitive function appears intact. Sato's voice was hushed, reverent. Dr. Tanaka, it worked, it actually worked. In the operating theater, Vera Lindstrom, the new Vera Lindstrom, housed in a body that had never been born, raised her hands and stared at them. Her fingers flexed, testing the unfamiliar flesh, learning the new neural pathways that connected thought to movement. It feels strange, she said. Like wearing clothes that don't quite fit. Everything is almost right, but not quite. That's normal, Tanaka assured her, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Your consciousness needs time to fully integrate with the new substrate. The disorientation will fade. Will it? Vera looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, of wrongness, that made Tanaka's triumph feel suddenly fragile. Dr. Tanaka, when I was in the darkness. Between the old body and the new, I felt something else, something watching. The room went quiet. Tanaka leaned closer to the glass. What did you feel, Vera? Hunger. The word came out as barely a whisper. I felt something hungry, something that wanted to follow me through, something that was reaching for the light I was moving toward. She wrapped her arms around herself, and despite the temperature-controlled environment of the lab, she shivered. I don't think I was alone in there, Dr. Tanaka. I don't think any of us will be alone in there. The celebration lasted 3 days. Word of the successful transfer spread through the facility like wildfire, reaching every department, every researcher, every skeptic who had ever dismissed Tanaka's work as mysticism dressed in scientific language. They came to the newborn labs in droves. To see the miracle, to examine the data, to watch Vera Lindstrom walk and talk and demonstrate in every measurable way that she was still herself despite having died and been reborn. The government representatives were particularly enthusiastic. They spoke of applications, of implications, of the dawn of a new era for humanity. Death itself had been conquered. The greatest enemy had been defeated. Tanaka accepted their congratulations with grace, gave interviews that were broadcast across human space, stood for photographs with officials who had ignored his requests for funding for decades. But in the quiet moments, when the crowds dispersed and the cameras stopped recording, he found himself returning to Vera's observation room, watching her through the one-way glass, noting the small signs that something wasn't quite right. She scratched at her skin constantly, a nervous habit she'd never had before, as if the flesh didn't quite belong to her. She spoke to people who weren't there, brief conversations that she cut off abruptly when she noticed others watching. She stood at windows for hours, staring at nothing, her expression cycling through emotions that didn't quite match any normal human pattern. Adjustment period, Dr. Sato assured him when he raised his concerns. The consciousness needs time to fully bond with the new substrate. The disorientation is temporary. What about the scratching, the conversations with invisible people? Stress responses, residual neural patterns from the transfer process. Nothing outside expected parameters. But Sato's voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before, and she no longer met Tanaka's eyes when she delivered her reassurances. On the 4th day after the transfer, Vera asked to speak with Tanaka privately. They met in his office. the same cluttered space where he had spent 23 years pursuing a dream that was now reality. Vera sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her new face wearing an expression that he couldn't quite read. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I haven't told the others. Go ahead." When I was in the darkness, in the space between dying and waking up here, I heard voices. Not just the hungry thing I mentioned before, other voices, human voices. Tanaka leaned forward. "What did they say?" "They were screaming." Vera's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Thousands of them, maybe millions. Screaming and crying and begging for help. They were trapped in there, Dr. Tanaka, trapped in the darkness, and they couldn't get out." "Trapped? You mean other consciousness transfers? People who didn't make it through?" "I don't know. I don't think so. They felt old, ancient, like they'd been there forever, screaming into the void with no one to hear them." She looked down at her hands, her new hands, grown in a lab, animated by a consciousness that had crossed the threshold of death. "And some of them tried to follow me out. I felt them reaching for me, trying to grab hold, trying to use me as a rope to pull themselves into the light." "Did any of them succeed?" Vera was silent for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were wet with tears. "I don't know," she said. "That's what scares me, Dr. Tanaka. I don't know if I came back alone. I don't know if what's inside this body is just me, or if something else came through too. And I don't know how I would tell the difference." She reached out and gripped his hand with desperate strength. "Something is wrong. I can feel it. This body, this existence, it's not quite right. There's something underneath, something that shouldn't be there. And it's getting stronger." Tanaka didn't know what to say. The triumph of the past 3 days suddenly felt hollow, built on foundations that might be cracking beneath his feet. "We'll run more tests," he said finally. "We'll figure out what's happening. We'll fix it." "Can you fix it?" Vera's voice was small, frightened. "Can you fix something that might not have a name, that might not even exist, according to everything your science believes?" He had no answer. All he could do was hold her hand and wonder what exactly he had unleashed. The second successful transfer came 2 weeks later. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth. Volunteers lined up, terminal patients, aging researchers, anyone who looked at death approaching and decided they wanted another option. The process was refined, streamlined, made more efficient with each iteration. The government poured resources into newborn, recognizing the strategic value of a technology that could preserve consciousness indefinitely. The other departments at Prometheus, the ones that had mocked Tanaka for decades, now found themselves competing for his attention and approval. It should have been everything he'd ever wanted. But the problems were accumulating too. Subject 3 reported persistent dysphoria, a sense of wrongness in the new body that no amount of therapy or adjustment could alleviate. She described feeling like a stranger in her own flesh, like she was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. Subject 7 began having nightmares, vivid, recurring dreams of the darkness between bodies, of the hungry things that waited there, of voices screaming in the void. He woke up clawing at his skin, trying to tear off a body he no longer recognized as his own. Subject 12 attempted to end her new existence 3 weeks after the transfer. She was found in her quarters, having tried to open her wrists with a piece of broken glass. The Einherjar body had healed almost immediately. The warp-reactive tissue was remarkably resilient, but the psychological damage was harder to repair. "I just want to go back," she told the psychiatric team that evaluated her. "I want to be dead again. At least in the darkness, I knew what I was. Here in this thing, I don't know anymore. I don't know if I'm still me or if I'm something else pretending to be me." Tanaka read the reports with growing unease. The transfer process worked. The data proved that beyond any doubt, consciousness was successfully moved from one substrate to another. Memories were preserved, personalities remained intact, cognitive function continued unimpaired. But something was being lost in the translation. Some essential quality that made existence bearable, that made a person feel at home in their own mind. The Einherjar were alive, were conscious, were demonstrably the same individuals who had died. They just didn't feel like themselves anymore. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the labs were empty and the corridors silent, Tanaka found himself wondering about Vera's warning, about the voices in the darkness, the hungry things that reached for the light, the screaming souls that had been trapped there forever. What if the transfer process didn't just move consciousness from one body to another? What if it opened a door that was meant to stay closed? What if something was using that door to come through? He pushed the thoughts away, buried them under data and protocols and the endless work of refining his miracle. But they kept returning, persistent as the screams that haunted his subjects' dreams. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, in the spaces between thoughts, in the expressions of the people who had trusted him with their deaths. Something was very, very wrong. Chapter 10. The criminal experiments. The government directive arrived 6 months after the first successful transfer, delivered by a deputy minister who smiled too much and spoke in the careful language of bureaucratic euphemism. The omnistate recognizes the extraordinary value of your research, Dr. Tanaka. The applications for military, industrial, and governmental purposes are virtually unlimited. However, the current pace of development is insufficient for our strategic needs. Tanaka sat across from the deputy minister in the facility's main conference room, flanked by Director Ferris and a half-dozen government observers whose expressions ranged from eager to predatory. "We're processing volunteers as quickly as safety protocols allow," Tanaka said carefully. "Each transfer requires extensive preparation and the post-integration monitoring." "Yes, the volunteers." The deputy minister's smile widened. "That's precisely the bottleneck we need to address. Volunteers are limited in number, require extensive psychological screening, and have a tendency to develop complications that slow down the research process. The complications you're referring to are human beings experiencing profound psychological distress. The complications I'm referring to are acceptable losses in the context of a project with implications for the future of our entire species." The smile never wavered. "Dr. Tanaka, the omnistate has identified a resource that could dramatically accelerate your timeline while reducing the impact of any unsuccessful outcomes." He slid a data tablet across the table. Tanaka picked it up, read the contents, and felt the blood drain from his face. "You want us to use condemned prisoners? We want you to use subjects who have already forfeited their rights under omnistate law. Criminals convicted of capital offenses, scheduled for termination, whose deaths would otherwise contribute nothing to human progress." The deputy minister spread his hands. "This is not cruelty, Dr. Tanaka. This is efficiency. These individuals are going to die regardless. Why not let their death serve a greater purpose? Without their consent. Consent is a luxury extended to citizens in good standing. These subjects surrendered that privilege when they committed their crimes." Tanaka looked around the room, searching for support, for someone who shared his revulsion. Director Ferris wouldn't meet his eyes. The government observers watched him with the patient attention of predators waiting for prey to exhaust itself. "This is wrong," he said finally. "This is a violation of everything. This is a directive, Dr. Tanaka, not a request." The deputy minister's smile finally faded, replaced by something harder and colder. "The omnistate has invested considerable resources in newborn, We expect returns on that investment. If you're unwilling to provide them, we can find someone who is." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. 23 years of work, everything Tanaka had built, everything he had sacrificed, all of it could be taken away with a single administrative decision. "The research protocols," he began, "will be modified to accommodate the new subject pool. Your team will be expanded with personnel selected by the ministry. Security measures will be enhanced to prevent any unfortunate incidents. And if I refuse?" The deputy minister stood, straightening his immaculate uniform. "Then you will be reassigned to a facility more suited to your talents, and Newborn will continue under new leadership. The work is too important to be held hostage by individual scruples, Dr. Tanaka. The Omnistate appreciates your contributions, but it does not require your approval." He walked out, trailing observers behind him. The door closed with a soft click that sounded, to Tanaka's ears, like the ceiling of a tomb. The first involuntary subject arrived 2 weeks later, escorted by guards whose faces were hidden behind opaque visors. His name was Dmitry Volkov, no relation to the disappeared researcher, as far as anyone could determine. He had been convicted of multiple homicides, sentenced to death by neural dissolution, and redirected to Newborn as part of the new accelerated research program. He was 34 years old, physically healthy and absolutely terrified. "I didn't agree to this," he said as they strapped him to the integration table. His voice was steady, but his eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal's. "I was supposed to die, just die clean and quick, not whatever this is." Dr. Sato prepared the transfer equipment, her movements mechanical, her face carefully blank. She had argued against the program in private, had threatened to resign, had ultimately stayed because someone needed to ensure that the subjects were treated as humanely as possible. It was a compromise that left her feeling sick every time she entered the lab. "The process is painless," she said, the lie coming easier with practice. "You'll lose consciousness in the original body and wake up in the new one. The transition takes less than a minute from your subjective perspective. And then what? I'm still a prisoner, still condemned. Your legal status remains unchanged, but you'll be alive, you'll have a chance to what? Be your lab rat forever. Let you poke and prod and study whatever you turn me into." Volkov laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the sterile walls. "Some choice, death or slavery." Tanaka watched from the observation room, unable to look away, unable to stop what was happening. The government minders stood behind him, recording everything, ensuring compliance with the new directives. "Beginning transfer sequence," Sato announced, her voice flat. Volkov screamed as the process began, not from pain exactly, but from the violation of having his consciousness ripped from one substrate and forced into another. The volunteer subjects had welcomed the transfer, had opened themselves to it, had made the crossing willingly. This was different. This was conquest. The Einherjar that woke on the other table was Dmitry Volkov in every measurable way. Same memories, same personality patterns, same cognitive architecture. But there was something in its eyes that the volunteer subjects hadn't shown. A rage, a hatred, a desperate fury at what had been done to it. "You think you've saved me?" it snarled, straining against the restraints that held it to the table. "You think this is mercy? I can feel what you've put me in. I can feel it watching me from inside my own skull. You didn't transfer me into a new body. You trapped me in a cage with something else." "There's nothing else," Sato said, but her voice wavered. "The Einherjar substrate is clean. There's nothing in there but the consciousness we transferred." "Then why can I hear it breathing? Why can I feel it pressing against the inside of my thoughts?" The Einherjar, Volkov, turned its head to look directly at Tanaka through the observation window. "You've done something wrong, Doctor. You've built a door and you've shoved us through it, and you don't even know what's on the other side." The government minders made notes on their tablets. Subject exhibiting paranoid ideation. Possible transfer trauma. Continue observation. But Tanaka saw the way Sato's hands trembled as she administered the sedative. He saw the looks exchanged between the technicians, the fear they were trying to hide. He saw the truth that no one wanted to speak aloud. The voluntary subjects had reported something similar, the feeling of not being alone, of something else sharing their new existence. It had been dismissed as adjustment disorder, as the disorientation of consciousness adapting to an unfamiliar substrate. But what if it wasn't? What if the darkness that Vera Lindstrom had described, the hungry things that reached for the light, the screaming voices of the trapped? What if all of it was real? What if every transfer opened the door a little wider? The involuntary program continued for 4 months. 37 subjects were processed, their condemned bodies terminated, their consciousness forced into Einherjar forms that they had never asked for and didn't want. The results were catastrophic. The voluntary subjects had struggled with dysphoria, with the sense of wrongness in their new bodies. The involuntary subjects were destroyed by it. They attacked staff members, tried to escape, attempted to end their unwanted existences by any means available. 3 of them managed to inflict enough damage on their Einherjar forms to achieve something like death, though even that was uncertain, given the warp-reactive tissue's remarkable ability to regenerate. The others were restrained, sedated, contained in observation rooms where they could be studied without risk to personnel. But the restraints didn't stop their screaming, and the sedatives didn't stop their dreams, and the containment didn't stop the spread of something that was beginning to look less like psychological trauma and more like infection. The voluntary subjects began to change too. Their adjustment periods grew longer, their dysphoria more severe, their reports of presences in their minds more frequent and more detailed. They started having the same dreams, visions of darkness and hunger, of doors opening onto things that should never be seen, and some of them stopped wanting to resist. Subject 12, the woman who had tried to end herself 3 weeks after transfer, was the first to embrace whatever was happening to her. She stopped fighting, stopped screaming, stopped begging to be allowed to die. Instead, she began to smile. "They're beautiful," she told the psychiatric evaluator who interviewed her. "The things in the darkness. They're so lonely, so desperate to be understood. All they want is to be close to us, to share what they are." "Who are they?" Subject 12. "The family." Her smile widened, warm and welcoming and utterly empty of human emotion. "They've been waiting for us for so long, and now that we've built them a door, they're finally able to come home." The evaluator noted the response, flagged it as concerning, recommended continued observation. 3 days later, Subject 12 was found outside her containment room, somehow having bypassed the security locks that should have been impossible for her to circumvent. She was standing in the corridor, speaking to empty air, her voice carrying words in a language that no human had ever used. When security approached her, she turned to face them with a smile that no longer quite fit her face. "It's too late to stop it," she said, her voice layered with harmonics that made the guards' ears ache. "The door is open, the family is coming through, and there's room for everyone, whether they want it or not." She collapsed then, her Einherjar body suddenly limp, her consciousness apparently retreating into whatever darkness had claimed her. But her smile remained, fixed on her face like a mask that didn't quite fit. And in the observation rooms throughout the newborn facility, 36 other Einherjar turned their heads in unison, looked toward the door and began to smile the same smile. Tanaka watched the security feeds, watched the synchronized movement, watched the spreading expression that was nothing like human happiness. He had wanted to conquer death. He had wanted to prove that consciousness could survive the destruction of the body. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. And now something was using his success to tear open the walls of reality and let the hungry things through. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty room. The faces on the screens smiled back at him and said nothing.